Good morning, everybody. So let's start today one more seminar from our seminar series. Today we have Hans Mueller. He's a researcher in IAE-CSIC in Barcelona, and he has a large and extended record of scientific publications in very nice journals. And today he's going to present a paper on the hard problem of predicting for prevention. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And so this is obviously joint work with Christopher Rao, who is now moving to Oxford University, and it's an ongoing project which we will very soon, hopefully, transform into something that is less academic and is becoming more policy-oriented. I'm happy to talk about it later, maybe, if you're interested. And the motivation is really coming from the policy side. So civil wars are obviously a very serious humanitarian and economic problem, and we fail to prevent them. Right? You see this a lot recently. So there's a lot of violence. Actually, long-term trends of decline in civil wars have reversed in the last 5 years, I would say. We have more and more. Now Latin America has destabilized massively, so it's clearly a relevant problem, right, to think about conflict. And this is reflected in large expenditures on crisis response. So we have a humanitarian response of around $25 billion in 2014 alone. Peacekeeping is a large expense, about $8 billion per year. And so thinking about these expenses and of course the humanitarian disasters that are behind these expenses, there is a lot of rethinking inside the UN and inside the World Bank of how to deal with this. And the UN, because it's responsible for peacekeeping and many of the security questions, they have a long process of thinking about this. And there's actually a bunch of reports that came out in the 10,000s. For example, this one from an expert panel. It's called the Review of the United Nations Peacekeeping Architecture, 2015. And one of the statements in that review is that if more global priority were consistently given to efforts at sustaining peace, might there not, over the course of time, be a reduced need for crisis response? Right. So this is saying if we do more to prevent, then we would save money reacting to it, right? So maybe all this money on the table that you see there, maybe we can prevent spending that. And of course, I mean, from a very, very humanitarian perspective, of course, if you do prevention, you don't have the suffering to start with, right? So even without kind of very self-interested money perspective, you would have an interest in prevention. And so that's kind of the, yeah.
Just to understand the figures. You're saying 24,000 million US?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And this is right. So this was the heyday of the Syrian crisis, together with Afghanistan and others.
No, I'm thinking low rather than high.
It's billion.
A billion.
Yeah, 24,000 US. Globally.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like a big number at all.
24,000 million, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's scarce, the money. So the agencies in that year complained that it was not enough, right? So definitely too low in many respects.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
Okay, so we take prevention as a starting point, and this is really important for keeping in mind what drives us. Right, so we the whole project is born around the idea of like we as academics might be helpful in this effort. Okay, and so prevention really is the driving force of the project. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to define the hard problem in prevention. And I'm going to explain first why it's hard, and then why it's a problem. And then I'm going to offer a solution and the solution we have is a topic model with news text. And so the topic model is basically providing summaries of the text. And then we use the summaries in a random forest model. And I'm going to be kind of spending some time on this. I'm going to spend some time on this actually because for two reasons. First of all, economists usually don't know these methods quite so well. So I think it's kind of like a learning possibility. And I'm obsessed about these methods right now. So it's kind of these two things come together in my recent presentations. And then if I have time, which I probably won't with 45 minutes, I will speculate why it works. I think it's really interesting, but probably won't get to this. And then, you know, again, if I have time, we talk about research directions we're taking now. So the data we use is the violence data that comes from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, UCDP. I recommend you, if you're at all interested in data work, this is a fantastic webpage, the GED, georeferenced data, worldwide. You know, you have very specific events happening in different cities and so on and so forth. So that's the data set, GED. This is quarterly, so what we do is that it gives us quarterly data for countries between 1989 and 2017. So that's the data we use. That's our kind of like the outcome, yeah?
That's the start date of the database?
Yes, let's start this exactly. Our data actually goes further back than this, but this is kind of be constrained by the database. There is a parent, so to speak, a database to this one, which goes further back and actually use that to construct a history of violence for the early years, right? So because I'll show you that history is a really important part of prediction, and so in order to have some history in the Q1 of 89, I'm going to use the kind of the previous data that they provide, which is much coarse. It's yearly data, so it's not as good. And so just to be totally clear on this, and this I'm doing this because I have experienced that this is really confusing for people who are not in this literature, okay? The data we see, or the data we use basically, is a bunch of zeros that are becoming a 1 at some stage. So this is no conflict, no conflict, no conflict, outbreak of conflict, okay? And then the way you usually code this is you code the 1s and then it becomes 0 at some stage again. Now what we do is we forecast the first one, and then we put everything else to missing, right? So we put missings here. And in fact, if you think about it, if you try to forecast this one, the really interesting year you're trying to distinguish from all the other quarters, sorry, quarters not years, is this one, right? So you're trying to distinguish this 0 from this 0 and from this 0. This is the key. This is the key point in time. Yeah. Why are we doing this? Why are we throwing away this data?
Yeah.
Because it's like weather. The best and easiest forecast is it's like yesterday. Okay. So if you are here, predicting that this is going to be a 1 is extremely easy, and forecasts become extremely good. So there's a lot of, in this literature, there's a lot of smoke screens, and like some people have sold their forecasts to policymakers by mixing the two kind of forecasting tasks, and they have really great performances. And that's usually because they have just packed in the ongoing ones with the ones that you already have. Okay, it's very easy. It's very easy to predict that there's going to be conflict in Syria next quarter, compared to is Chile going to have conflict next quarter. Okay, so this is this is the difference.
But that doesn't mean you should throw away that information, right? I mean, you once you predict, you have to look at the data points you really care about predicting, rather than throwing away information. It's not clear to me that
it's a different task. You can, I mean, of course, if you think of it slightly differently. Think of it as a forecasting task where you have a bunch of ones, and you're trying to predict the 0, and you're trying to distinguish this one from the other ones. Ah, sorry, I thought this not extremely useful. So you're trying to distinguish this one from the other ones, right? Because it's a classification task, so you can go both ways. And this is an interesting project. This is actually an interesting question. Can I distinguish this one from the other ones? Can I predict the end of the Civil War? Yeah. So I'm not saying that this is totally not useful, but it's a different task, and it's actually with our text it's not possible to do this. So our text is almost meaningless for predicting the end of the Civil War.
I think what I'm thinking is that the missing values you have there may contain information even to predict the outset, right?
Yeah, it might, but they usually don't make it better. It's true that we could train the model. Okay, we could train the model with the ones in, and then we could test the model. Exactly, we can test the model with this.
Yeah.
It tends not to be as great because the kind of news, and this is exactly also why we're not doing that great of predicting the end, because the news landscape changes a lot when you have violence. Right? Think of Syria and so on. You will not have like reports on like visit the old city of Damascus right now. Right? It's just like the news landscape has completely changed. You usually have like news on like, okay, the movement of the rebels is from this city to this city, and so the information set that you have in to distinguish this 0 from the other zeros is going to be very different from the kind of is this civil war going on one more year? This is a very different kind of forecasting task. I can come back to that. I think it's not. I think it's an interesting question, but I'm just from experience I can tell you this doesn't help very much. Okay, so we use 2 thresholds to define a 0 here, right? Because I've coded everything 0, 1, and of course the violence is continuous. Okay, so I'm using 2 thresholds, which is 1, which is no violence at all, and then some violence, right? Any violence. And the other one is 50, which is like you already have something ongoing, somebody might die, but like it's not like it hasn't become like a really in a quarter within like 3 months 50 people dying. That's kind of the second threshold where a conflict is much more severe, and it's kind of the median more or less in the in terms
number of people dying.
Yeah, 50. Yeah. Okay, and so I will call throughout the talk. I will call them any violence or armed conflict. Okay, armed conflict is the higher threshold, and any violence is the lower threshold. Okay, so here's the kind of the hard problem introduction, basically. What you see here is the likelihood that once you're coming out of conflict here on this side. So you had a conflict, right? And think about what's the likelihood that you're going to have another one in the next quarter. Okay, so this is what I'm showing you in these graphs. And what you see here is that if you're coming out of conflict in the first quarter, which is here, the likelihood that you have another armed conflict in the next quarter is over 30%, which is extremely high risk. Okay, so any country that is in that kind of risk is extremely, extremely high risk. And the risk falls rapidly, but it stays kind of high, around 10%, 5%, and then maybe like 3-4%. These are quarters, so at least for another 10 years. Okay, and the same pattern, exactly the same pattern is for any violence. So this is not driven by the cutoff we choose. This is a very, very general pattern. It's actually well known in the conflict literature. This is called the conflict trap. The conflict trap is once you had a conflict, the likelihood that you have another conflict later is very high. Okay, so countries are caught in this trap because if you think about the cumulative likelihood that you escape this whole thing is actually quite low, right? Because even if you multiply something 0.9 and you keep multiplying 0.9, in the end it leads to something that like this likelihood of escaping this thing is actually not that high. It's one third of the countries actually end up escaping it, right? And so And so what does this mean? This means that outside the post-conflict period, the forecasting is extremely hard. Okay? If I'm not here, if I'm not in this area, but I'm like before something happened or after I have stabilized again, I'm in this baseline likelihood. Okay? So this red dot is the average outside that period. And you see that it's almost, you cannot, from where you're sitting, probably you can't even see the difference between that and zero. Right? It's very, very low. Very, very low baseline risk. And so this is what we call the hard problem. The hard problem is try to distinguish Peru, Chile, Germany, Spain from each other, from the news landscape that they have. Okay? And try to figure out which of those is like more likely to have a conflict next quarter. So given that it's so hard, why should we try that, right? Why can't we just focus on those cases? These are the cases that are easy. Why not just focus on those? My argument would be that you actually don't need sophisticated forecasting methods. You just focus on the countries that just came out of conflict and just intervene on those, and that's basically what we do right now, right? So peacekeeping, all this kind of stuff, it's all post-conflict actions. And I think but the more kind of theoretically based argument is that actually the pre-conflict stabilization is the one that actually prevents something. The other stuff is just like you wait for it to happen and then you intervene after it happened. And so I think if you want to do prevention, we should really look at those cases, at the ones where nothing has happened before. You have this huge amount of zeros for years, decades. You have zeros, zeros, zeros. And then you have this one zero which is different from the other zeros. That's the it's the needle in the hay we're trying to find.
So one thing that I'm thinking of that may apply to the easy and the hard problem is if you're really trying to predict, then you have to stop somewhere and do out of sample prediction.
Yeah, we're going to get there. I'm going to get there. Another reason that it's really driven by kind of, I've been engaging with UN, World Bank, and IMF, actually all three of them, and they clearly want to move ahead of the curve. Now they want to move ahead of this. They are all caught in this kind of. Something's happening. I would say like, oh my God, something's happening. We should do something, and then they do something, right? So these organizations are also caught in this, and so they also want to move ahead of this, and so. We as academics maybe should provide them with help on this. Okay. The literature on conflict. I'm going to skip this. Basically, my summary is this. It's a bit unfair, but not very unfair. Okay. So, economists are obsessed with the causal identification of conflict drivers, right? So for good reasons, where we try to understand how the world works. But sadly, this is almost completely useless for prediction. And therefore, I can completely ignore the economics literature on this. And we have another paper where we actually show this. It's actually surprising, but it doesn't work. If you might think about why is something that is not causally driving something not a predictor, is power. The question is, right, there's a difference here between power and significant relationships, right? So what you're trying to do in a way, just to give you very broad ideas, you're trying to maximize the R squared here, not the significance of something. And so basically all this literature that of course I have contributed myself to, but I'm going to ignore all that. And I'm going to our peers are much more the political science guys. I don't really understand why we leave that field to the political scientists, to be honest, and I'm a bit upset about that myself. But that's right now. That's how it is.
I'm sorry, I know that you don't want to spend too much time on this, but can you explain a little bit more on why these drivers are not very good for the forecast? I mean, this trade-off between significance and power. Can you elaborate a little bit more on
so that? Think of like I'm just giving this as an example. It's not trying to attack that paper in particular, but think of the rainfall paper, right? So this is well, the name for literature, no? Miguel et al., JPE. So they find a significant relationship between rainfall staying away, and then a collapse in the GDP, and the outbreak of a civil war. Okay, so say the R squared is like 1% of the within variation, or can be even lower. So you have like 99% of all the cases, all the years, have no signal, right? It's significant. It's like you find, because it's very sharp, and you have some cases where something happens. You find that there's a significant relationship, but it's not the main driver. It's not like the main variable. What these guys do, the predictors, right? They do all the things that we hate, which is they run it on all the endogenous stuff, like political institutions and GDP, and like without any instrument, without instrumenting for it. They just put a bunch of variables in, and they see which ones are the ones that float. No?
Right.
And
yeah, so you mean that for forecast you want to have anything that is correlated, whether it's
exactly.
Okay.
And vice versa. It's not only like a dominance thing here. It's really sometimes you have the best instrument in the world, but it's the power of that thing in the grand scheme of things is just negligible. Yeah. Okay. So and then of course there's a whole literature that is opening up that I'm personally super excited about, which is machine learning. I'm going to get into that a lot. So let me ignore this to a big degree, except for we still tackle with the fact that machine learning is very good for prediction. It's not very good for doing anything causal. In this paper, of course, that's not a big problem because we're doing prediction, so therefore we're using these tools extensively. Okay, so our solution for the problem is we download all articles that mention the country in the title. So for example, the New York Times has an article that's called Libya is going down the drain, then we download that article. And we download for the BBC Monitor, which is an aggregation news aggregator, which is looking at local sources and lots of sources worldwide, translates them to English, and then puts them into a database. We look at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Economist, and we follow standard procedures for text cleaning, which is you usually simplify the words in a way. You drop out stop words and so on. And after lemmatizing, which is like you go to the stem of a word, we are left with 0.8 billion tokens. And this is very important to understand how this looks. So tokens here are like 1 word, 2 word, and 3 word combinations. So the President of the United States, right? We drop the off and the because they are stop words. So we are left with President United States. This 3 word combination appears a lot in the text, right? Because it's a kind of thing that, a lot. This tends to happen, right? And so we keep these 3 words in that combination, and they become just one variable. It's a one variable in a very, very large vector of variables. Okay, so the text, we can summarize all the text in a vector that's just the count of those words, right? So we have 3 times the President of the United States. We have twice the word machine. We have whatever, right? Okay, so these are the x, the right hand side x vector that we have. And so even though we drop rare words and we drop the stop words, which are very common, so we do some cleaning, we still have 0.8 million right hand side variables. Okay, so this is way too large from the dimensionality to run anything useful that we are used to run. Right? You cannot run an OLS regression here. The left hand side zeros and ones, and the right hand side 0.8 variable. Right? There's no degrees of freedom. And so this is where the problem is. We need to reduce the dimensionality. And we could do this. This is possible. We could do this with supervised learning. Okay? This is what machine learning was developed for. Like you have high dimensional right hand side, and you need to figure out what are the driving factors for the left hand side. The problem here is that the data is small. It's actually not a big data problem, right? So this is why I also tend not to like the expression big data, because big data is a catch-all word for something that very often is not very big data. This is definitely not big data here. We have 20,000 observations of zeros and ones. right? And therefore, the problem we have is not a big data problem. The problem is a very small data problem in a sense. And therefore, we need to reduce the dimensionality without using supervised learning. And what we do is we use a summary statistic, a summary method, which is called the latent Dirichlet allocation. Okay, this was introduced by Blying and Jordan. And David Bly has a really good webpage, and I recommend everyone to check out his webpage. And so what are topics? Topics are probability distributions over the tokens. So think of these 0.8 million entries. And I say, if I'm writing in topic 1, you're going to be drawing from that topic vector some words with a higher probability than others. Okay? So if I, for example, write about tourism, okay, I'm going to write the words hotel, wine, beach much more likely than other words. Okay? And the topic model is capturing this logic. It's saying, if you're writing in this topic, you're going to use a different distribution over the words than in this. Okay, it's a model of writing, so to speak. It's almost micro-motivated model of writing. The nice thing about the latent Dirichlet allocation, Dirichlet is a function, a distribution function, is that you can model the text in a statistical way this way, and therefore you can use it for estimation. So basically, the way it works is you just tell the algorithm there are 15 topics in this text, in this 3.8 million newspaper texts. And the algorithm, completely without any supervision, without you telling anything at all, goes through the whole text, reads it, and then says there's these 15 topics, and gives you the probability distribution of all 15 topics, and tells you about each article. This is 20% topic 1, 30% topic 2, and so on and so forth. Okay? And it does this, first of all, unsupervised, but it does that through the co-occurrence of the words in text. So if it sees, these words, they always appear together, let me construct a topic around these words. I mean, you can think of it as principal component analysis. It's a clustering method, right? It just uses a certain model underlying it, right? So it's just a more sophisticated clustering method. That's called unsupervised machine learning. Unsupervised machine learning is like you generate patterns without giving it the zeros and the ones, right? So just like clustering does. And so what we do is we try topics 5, 10, 15, 30, 50. What you might see if you know the IDA is that this is a very low number of topics. Usually people use like 75, 100, 200, 300 topics. Why do we use so few? Well, again, we want to use the topics for forecasting, and we have a small data problem, so we cannot have a lot of variables on the right-hand side. So we want to have very few variables. We want to have very brutal summaries. We want to see broad tendencies in the data. In order to get these broad tendencies in the data, we need to aggregate the data up to a very high degree. And therefore, we have relatively few topics. And this is how it looks. So the thing that comes out of it, usually I try to do this without giving you the labels. The labels obviously come from us. But you see here, for example, right? So you see the size of the word. This is just the tip of the iceberg, right? It's just the top 50 words in the probability distribution that comes out in this topic. And of course, economics, forget about the label that I gave to it. But you see bank, economy, dollar, company, economy, billion, website, I don't know why, busy, yeah? Business, sorry, this is business. Market, yeah? So you see that's definitely different than, say, this one. Border, region, fight, arm, military, army, commander, troop, operation, area, yeah? So very clearly, these two things are very different, yeah? And so what's clear from inspection of these probability distributions is that the algorithm has figured out something, an underlying structure of language in the text. And so we use that underlying structure in the text to predict now. Okay, so we're going to use these summaries of the text to do forecasting. So the composition of each article M in terms of the K topics is given by this, and then we use that. I'm not going to go through the detail now. You summarize those things. It's just basically, think of this as it's like a Bayesian updating using those values. to say, in that quarter, 20% was economics, 10% was conflict, 15% was military, 5% was tourism, and so on. Okay? So we have kind of folded a very complex space of X into a much, much simpler space of X. Right? So we have now, I'm trying to predict the outcome next period, right? The zeros and the ones, using a function of conflict history and the text. And the text now is just summaries of text, which has dimensions 15 or so. Yeah.
Sorry, and how do you link this topic shares to the countries?
Sorry, this is from the download already. From the download, we remember that I said when you say Libya is going down the drain, we download the text. So we have all the text already categorized by country.
But in some cases, there will be one test, there will be more than one country, right?
Exactly. Very often what will happen is that we will have downloaded it twice then. We will have downloaded it once for Libya and once for, if it says like Congo and Rwanda are fighting for something, then
So
you know.
it comes out.
In a rule, exactly, European board. Okay, and so the key thing here is that we will want to benchmark things with the history of dummies capturing post-conflict dynamics, right? So this is what I told you before. This kind of this declining thing. What we do is like we say, give us one dummy for the first quarter after conflict, one dummy for the first year after conflict, one dummy for the first 5 years, and one dummy for the first 10 years to capture this declining trend. And what we want to beat is basically that benchmark, right? We want to beat it, and then we want to focus on the cases where this doesn't exist. Basically, we do not have a history. All those dummies are zero, and we want to check, can we still predict with the text? Okay, so, and now comes the key point. It's just coming back to your question from the very beginning on out of sample. So, we come up with a function f that links these variables, the history and the text, to an outcome next period. And what we do is we produce fitted values then for t+1, where we have used only the information available until t. And this is the way we evaluate the performance of the model. We go second quarter 2001. What was all the information you had available, including the histories and the text and everything, until then? We estimate the topic model using only that text. We produce a prediction for quarter 3 2001. And then we move one quarter forward and we use all the information available in quarter 3 and we produce a prediction for quarter 4. Okay? So all you're going to see, the performance measures that I'm going to show you, are always not using the information that is available in that period, but using it until just before that to predict the period.
So then df is time varying, right? The function
Exactly, completely right. You're completely right. Actually, everything here is time varying. The h's, the thetas, and the
Right.
f are all time varying. Yes, you're completely right.
Okay.
The topic model is also time varying, right? Because we re-estimate the topic model
Right.
every time we do this.
Okay.
Yeah? This was the problem that we had in the very beginning. We didn't think of this. We estimated the topic model for all the years, and then somebody in the seminar said, yeah, but if you estimate the topic model, you have already used in a very subtle way the information from the future, right?
Yeah.
So this is actually what takes a long time, because we need to do, for every quarter, we need to re-estimate the model, which generates a lot of calculation necessity. Okay, so we do this for all the years between 2000 quarter 1 and 2017 quarter 4. Why do we start so late? Why do we, I mean, I told you, right? We have data from 89. The reason is that it's a small data problem. We need data to estimate the f function in any reasonable way. So we start kind of halfway to have some chunk of history that we can use for predicting the f, right? For constructing the f, sorry. Yeah? And then we start with the out-of-sample performance test. We start in 2000. And so we have one model which is just based on history, and then the other one. So now, how much time do I have?
Well, you still have 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. So I'm going to go a little bit through I'm going to go a little bit through the construction of the F, okay, if you don't mind. The results are going to be like an afterthought to the talk. It's going to be like, and then his results, okay? So, to construct F, and this is the big difference to the existing paper that is published already, because we have quarterly data in this paper. So we have 20,000 observations, which is, it's not big data, but it's some data at least, right? It's not yearly data where you have only 1,000 observations. So we were a bit more ambitious here, and what we tried to do is we used supervised learning, right? So the difference between unsupervised learning, the LDA, to supervised learning is that now we tell the algorithm, yeah, this is a 0 that is special, and this is a 0 that is not special. Try to distinguish these two from each other and construct the F such that you can do that. Right? It's a classification exercise, very classic in machine learning. It's a very standard problem, right? Google, Yahoo, they have all invested millions of dollars with cats versus dogs, right? So people clicking on dogs and cats and dogs and cats. Every time you check in Facebook, it asks you, can you mark the cars and whatever, and they use that information to train really sophisticated deep learning networks too. So this is all supervised learning. We use that here, right? We use a random forest. What is a random forest? A random forest is a very intuitive thing. That's why I like it so much. It starts with the whole data set. You obviously can't see this, but this is like 16,700 observations. Of those, 700 are ones and 16,000 something are zeros. And then it's trying to find one variable from a set of random variables. It's kind of saying, I'm only looking at this subset of the variables that I have available. So this is history and the topics. To distinguish the zeros from the ones. It's doing like, think of a Gini coefficient, right? It's trying to maximize the Gini coefficients, kind of trying to say like put all the ones in this direction and all the zeros in that direction, right? And then it's picking a variable that's able to distinguish those and picking the cutoff of that variable in a very good way, right? The best possible way. So it's then leads you then move to the next node, okay? If it's true, then you go in here, and then of course you have a different sample. Then it's drawing randomly from that sample. It's a bootstrapping method, so to speak. And then again, having a random sample of variables is generating another node further down, okay? And the same thing on this side. So what it does, it's basically resampling the data all the time, and it's resampling the different variables all the time. And so what you get in the very end is something like this, right? So the last node I've split the data on is post-violence years, 2 to 5, right? So we are in a node already where like this is if this is equal to 1. Sorry, if this is smaller, so then you didn't have this, right? So then you're in a situation where you didn't have a history, and then it's asking, is the military topic sufficiently high, right? And if this is not true, then it's going here, and if it's true, then it's going there. And you see that at the end, you have these values, okay? So, for example, the sample that is after you have gone through the whole tree, and you have always cost of the conditions depending on how you did, you have a sample of 3,040 zeros and 70 ones. Here you have a sample of 267 zeros and 35 ones, where you see that the share of ones here is much higher, right? So this is a much higher risk, so to speak, node to be in, right? And so what you get out of the random forest is an evaluation of a certain combination of the x values in an AND node. But this is a tree. I just showed you a tree. A forest is, you plant 200 of those trees, you do this repeatedly, and you evaluate every observation with the average score that comes out at the very end. The evaluation that you have in a random forest is the average across all the different trees. Okay? Why in hell would you do this? So why would you do it this way, that you draw random samples and random variables from the random samples? Okay? This is a method that recently has gained a lot of traction. And the reason you do this is that you generate a generalizable model this way, which is, of course, not fit perfectly to each situation, but it works across very different situations. And this is giving it a very high out-of-sample performance. So you can fit this model to a certain data set, and then it still performs in a different data set, or a different part of the data quite well. Okay, so this is kind of what comes out of the model. And what you see clearly is that the history completely dominates the scene. Yeah? So the variables that are most relevant are the post-violence quarter 1 and the post-violence quarters 2 to 4. These two variables are completely like, if you would just pick two variables to predict conflict, you would pick those two, right? But again, the key thing here is that very often these two are 0, and so there, that's when kind of the situation starts where you don't know what to do, what to forecast. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to spend some time on is, given that we have fitted values, now you need to decide when are you going to put the cutoff and say this is a 1 or this is a 0. Right? I've given you continuous values between 0 and 1, and like you're thinking, should I start warning from 0.5, from 0.6, from 0.7? What's high risk, what's low risk? Yeah? And so we need to decide on the cutoff. So if y hat is larger than c, I'm going to forecast conflict, and if it's not the case, I'm going to forecast peace. And here's the trade-off you face. So if you forecast peace, right, you forecast a 0, then you can either have a true negative, so it's actually a 0, or you can have a false negative, which is it's actually a 1. You have a conflict onset, but you haven't predicted that. If you predict the conflict onset, then you can either have a false positive, it actually happened, or a true positive, where it didn't happen, or it actually happened. Okay? It's called the confusion matrix. So you can either have so the two errors you can make basically is a false positive, which is you said something will happen, it didn't, or a false negative, which is you didn't see it coming and it happened. Right? So this is here the truth. Here's the truth is the piece, and here a true piece that you thought was a conflict. So to make clear how this relates to the cutoff, if you choose a very, very high cutoff, then you're never warning the UN, right? You're saying the UN, everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. And so that means that you have moved the forecast, you have given the piece a lot of space. You've moved this to very, very far here. So you're going to have produced very, very few false positives and a lot of false negatives, right? There's going to be surprising conflicts happening all the time. If you pick a very low cutoff, so you're moving this border here, what has happened is then you have not produced any positives, right? And you warn, so you have a lot of positives, you're warning all the time, so you have produced a lot of false positives. You're warning the UN, yeah, you should do this, you should do here, you intervene here, and lots of them are not useful. Okay, so this is the trade-off we're facing, and this literature has a very, very nice language to talk about this, and I think this is something that they definitely have ahead of us. Namely, we can produce statistics that are based on these 4 possibilities. Okay? The first is the true positive rate. The true positive rate is the share of ones that you have predicted correctly. Right? So true positives divided by the false negative plus the false true positives. So this is amongst the ones that actually happened, which share did you actually see coming? The other one is the false positive rate. The false positive rate is of the zeros that happened, which ones did you say were 1? Okay, so it's dividing the false positives you have generated by the true negatives. So this is the zeros of all the zeros that happened, right? These are all the zeros that happened. Which share did you say was a 1? Now, of course, I want this to be as high as possible. I want to spot all the ones that are there without producing a lot of false positives, right? For 1 everywhere, I'm going to have a very high false positive rate and a very high true positive rate. And if I never warn of anything, I'm going to have a very low true positive rate and a very low false positive rate. So this is the typical trade-off you face. And here's the curves that you can generate with this data. So what you see here is a curve that starts at 0, 0, where the lower axis is the false positive rate and the y-axis is the true positive rate. Again, I want this to be jumping to 1 without the other one going up by a lot. So the perfect forecast would be one where I have a true positive rate, I've seen all the ones coming, and I haven't produced any false positives while I do that. Okay? So think of it a bit like a Gini curve, where you really try to have this as far out as possible. And the summary statistics in this literature is the area under the curve, which is like the Gini coefficient in our world. Yeah. So you want this to be very edging towards here. And so what I'm showing you in the top row is the performance of 3 models in the overall data set. Namely, a model based only on text, which is in green, only on summaries of text. The conflict information, only the history dummies without text, and a combination of the two. And what you see, broadly speaking, is that text is basically useless, and all the power for the forecast comes from the history dummies, right? So this is a kind of depressing result, in the sense of you did a collection of 3.8 million newspaper articles, you did this fantastic fancy thing of summarizing them, and you get this kind of not so great improvement in the performance. But as I said before, history is a killer. Right? So if you have history, use history, don't do anything else. And this goes for all the variables that are out there, not just text. The interesting thing is, like, if you don't have a history, so if you are in the hard problem cases, right? If you're trying to distinguish Chile from Spain and so on and so forth, then we are immediately in a very different situation, and I'm showing you this in the top and the bottom row. Here, history, obviously, this is trivial. This is not something that should surprise you. History is completely useless. It's random. And the reason is, of course, if you don't have history, you cannot use history. It's very simple. And then all the forecasting power comes from text. And this is a kind of important finding, is that you can do actually pretty well with the text alone. Right? So if you look at this curve and at this curve, here you still have a pretty good AUC. I mean, that you can do something with text is maybe not so surprising, but if you would show you, for example, like a standard variable, like a commodity price and so on and so forth, I did this very recently, you get a curve like this. That is much worse, right? So you can do actually pretty good forecasts just using the text.
I mean, good relative to what?
Good relative to other variables? Yeah, good relative to other variables. Yeah.
I mean, like long-term econ stuff is what you mean? Is that your baseline?
Long run econ stuff, commodity prices, like things that are available. Yeah. And so,
because one thing that you could do that I would find very convincing as a benchmark would
yeah.
be experts. No, I mean.
Yeah. Experts don't.
Maybe we don't need a model. Maybe experts really know where it's going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, 1 quarter ahead, right?
Yeah.
That's what you're doing.
Yeah.
So that's what you should do.
Yeah, if you get me the funding, I would definitely do that. But
no, I mean, there must be some kind of think tank or someone who's doing this systematically.
No.
No? Okay.
Not publicly, for sure.
Okay.
Like nobody provides for 190 countries evaluations on the quarterly basis. Doesn't
maybe
exist.
you can use a subsample to show that.
Yeah, but it's tricky, yeah. This is thing, like, of course, qualitative forecasts are everywhere, right? So like we really think there's a high risk, but like give me the number. That's much harder. There's a big debate about this. So there's this kind of whole literature on super forecasters, like how you would structure an expert group around forecasting something and how you would optimize that, and they become good or better or whatever. In the forecasting literature, there's a big debate. Like people that are kind of well known in the forecasting literature, they all say experts are really bad.
But predicting what? I mean,
predicting conflict.
This precise thing? Okay.
Yeah. And the reason is that once you force people to kind of distinguish 0.04%, 0.04 from 0.05, people become really bad. People become, usually the people who know a country and know the politics of a country are not necessarily people who can distinguish a 5% risk from a 3% risk.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Just sorry, it is more connected to that. But eventually, I mean, the news coming out in the newspaper.
Yeah.
they have to derive from
Yes, exactly.
somebody who are
Totally.
probably the experts. So, I mean,
Yeah. No, I mean,
so I mean, dealing directly with the experts that would probably give more better results in terms of prediction than taking
exactly.
those, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that I didn't make a statement. So this is like, it's a bit sad. We're gonna run out of time, but there's a lot of no, I'm not trying to kill comment. Just trying to say, like, I would love to talk about this more, because I think this is exactly where I think the interesting places where I would like to go, which is why can we forecast, right? And there's two possibilities actually here. One is like we are in a way we are aggregating expert opinion, expert here being the journalist, right? In a way that is making it quantitative, and that's your view, right? If you would move to a more direct source, if you would move to the source more directly, you would improve. The other thing is we're capturing something that actually the expert is not aware of,
Yeah.
right? Which is like, and this is something that we see. It's like you just see a certain kind of news and not another kind of news, right? So you see economics news tend to decline before conflict, for example, right? It's not a conscious decision. It's just like there's less reporting on certain kind of issues.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of on the same point. It's not that the news are really telling you that there's going to be a conflict. It's that it's a way to pick up something that nobody knows, because if
Yeah.
you knew, it would be relevant, right? So it's
Exactly. So, and this is. Let me just. There's another problem here, which is precision, which is really serious, and I think that's also where I think I think this is where the prediction is not good. Okay. I don't have time, right? It's like I'm running out of.
Well, you can, if you want to make this point, you can.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe let me just tell you this point before and then I wrap up. So now coming back to the performance, okay? I showed you the nice AUC. AUC looks really great. The problem with the AUC is the following. It splits the dimension of the zeros from the ones, and I'll show you the performance of those two things separately, in a way. Okay? The problem here is that, I told you this in the very, very beginning, is that we have many, many more zeros than ones, right? There's a sea of zeros, and I'm trying to predict a 1 in this sea of zeros. Okay? So with a false positive rate of just like a few %, I'm diluting the prediction that I make. Because the moment I'm saying this is a 1, I need to think about a very different problem. Namely, given that I say it's a 1, what's the likelihood that it is actually a 1? And from the true positive rate and the false positive rate alone, you cannot know that. It's impossible to know. You need to know the balance of the zeros and the ones in the data set. And this is exactly what precision does. Precision puts into a relationship the positives with the negatives. And you see that here. Namely, the true positive is the ones that are actually ones, and the false positive is the zeros that I said are ones. Right? So if I have a lot of zeros, then the precision is going to fall. Like even if I have these rates are the same across different data sets, if I put more zeros in the data set, at a sudden the precision will start to fall. Okay? And so for problems where there are a lot of zeros, they have a very serious precision problem, even for very good AUCs. Okay, it's a very important problem that is kind of well known in machine learning, but people tend to ignore it. Let's put it like mildly. Okay? And so if you predict a positive, what share will really be a positive? That's the question I'm asking with precision. And this is the precision recall curve. And here you see the dramatic performance difference. So I said before, well, the AUCs don't look that different. Here is the easy problem. And you see again, the history is doing all the jobs. And here you have the precision in the hard problem. And in the precision in the hard problem, you can't read that, but the precision basically falls from something that is very decent to something that is pretty bad very quickly. And I think there is a kind of soft spot, sweet spot, sorry, a sweet spot around like 20% of precision, but for very low true positive rates. So what you basically need to do is you need to say, okay, I'm not going to see a lot of things coming. I need to have the true positive rate very low. But then when I warn you, it's at least 1 in 5 cases, 1 in 10 cases are actually going to be 1. Okay, precision here is going to be between 10 and 5%. Right, so 10 and 5% is saying, I say it's a 1, but then you intervene in 9 countries, and those are going to be completely useless interventions, and 1 is going to actually be saving the day. Okay, so these are not great precision statistics. Okay, it's much better than standard variables and so on and so forth. We have a long discussion now in the paper, and it's getting bigger and bigger because we're trying to talk to economists, and they want to see kind of usually what other models look like. And so the last thing I'm going to show you is this. This is a summary sheet that tells you, for predicting any violence and armed conflict, which part of the variation is our model relying on. And you see here positive correlations and negative correlations with the onset of a conflict. Here the hard onset, and here the non-hard onset. And what you see is that, of course, military terror and violence, they tend to go up before a conflict breaks out. But there's a lot of stuff, namely daily life, economics, diplomacy, that has negative signal. So these things tend to go down, and then a conflict breaks out. Right? And so the nice thing about the way of summarizing this is that we can rely on a lot of variation, and it's not coming from just a few keywords, it's coming from, we're trying to grab the whole text to use it to do this forecast. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Anybody has any question?
Just to get back to the route that we took. But as a general suggestion, just for me, I mean, given the fact that you're well aware that it's very black boxed for people who are not expert on the machine learning techniques, one idea that I could have to make it more easy to grab is but also some narrative approach. So you can take a hard conflict emerged in the last 10, 15 years and analyze how the pattern of news in that conflict changed and show it, I mean, explicitly, so the reader can understand in an easier way how the approach works.
Yes. That's a nice idea. Yeah.
Oh yeah, mostly.
I mean, what we do is we have one graph in the paper where we show on average how do the topics move before a conflict breaks out. And so you see this decline in the econ stories, right? You see that the news that are covering economics start to decline, but that's an average across many countries.
Yeah, I was saying for specific. I mean, every onset is different, I guess.
Exactly.
And I don't know. Also, in the Chilean, in the case of Chile that you talked about, and you that classified as a hard conflict. I mean, in South America, there's a super long history of conflicts, dictatorships. We had the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil. I think that geopolitical expert would think of. I'm not a political science expert, but I'm saying that probably in the field they had the idea that after Bolsonaro's elections, the new wave of election, other economic scandals, there could have been an onset with 20% probability.
I mean,
I don't know if you understand my point.
Yeah, 20% would be extremely high. So that would be like Afghanistan would be 20%. But I think that the problem is really about the getting the timing right. Okay, so this forecasts, if you want to do it right and you don't want to produce very shitty statistics, is that you need to not say like, okay, Latin America is risky. You need to say, oh, this year Brazil is much higher than last year. That's the really the tricky thing, right? Because if you look at the literature also, right? The literature is very good in like using for things, for example, ethnic fragmentation, ethnic polarization, all these things to say there's a causal relationship from these things to conflict, but that of course has zero time variation, right? It's like you're predicting Congo is doomed, and then Germany is fine, right? So this is not what we do, right? We're trying to say, is Germany more risky or less risky? I don't have the graph. I have this very provocative graph. I don't know whether it's too bad. I don't have it here. You see it. You see Spain, right? So Spain is very interesting. recent years are looking bad. Right? So the Catalan crisis plus the Barcelona terror attack, you see this huge spike. It doesn't come down. It just like stays up. And of course, the risk we're talking about is like very low. It's like not nowhere, like it's not Uganda level, right? It's just like but it's just like the trends are looking bad. And I think this is like a kind of distinguishing this kind of thing, right? Saying like Spain is worse off than a few years ago. I think that's kind of where I think the method is important. Yeah.
So, and this model is to predict the breakup of, and what about the intensity?
That's a very good question. So you know, the intensity. So we have we're not trying it. We're not trying it partly because of my inability to think of a very good way of capturing the whole intensity together with the outbreak part, right? So I have a hard time thinking about like predicting both the onset and the intensity later, for example, in the conflict. We try to get around this a little bit by doing these different cutoffs. And what we realize is that the higher we pick the cutoff, the easier it becomes. Because very often you already have a low-level violence in the country, and it's then escalating into something bigger, right? So you're already working from a plateau, which is kind of very. There is already. You can even use like dummies for like low-level violence, and they do a lot of the work, and then the text on top of it is really very indicative of something happening, and so we're becoming better and better for higher intensity. But I'm not sure that is a really useful thing. I think to answer your question in the right way, what I would need to do is write down a model of escalation of violence and make a classification that has more than 2 levels. It has like say 10 levels or something, and say when are you transitioning to what level and so on and so forth, and make a full matrix of things. And we're working on the model because actually it's a conceptual work you need to do before you start to feed it into the data. So your question is actually a very hard question. Mm-hmm. So we're not saying anything on intensity, but the reason is that actually we have not solved the conceptual problem of doing that.
No, and also, I mean, asking because probably the main drivers would be quite different.
Yeah. You see that it's very interesting. If you do the forecast of the higher threshold, you see different variables doing the action. Yeah.
Because going back to Asia's point that perhaps there are some fundamental variables that could predict conflict very well, but what the results are suggesting is that think of the Chilean case, for example. So the breakup really happened because of the increase in the price of transportation, right? But sort of what your work is suggesting is that it was that, as it could have been some other things, right? There was something cooking up, and then there was the increase in
trigger,
right? Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
no, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting, in a way, is also you could, but this is like putting a lot of interpretation into something that is clean, right? I can show you the rock curves, and I show you this, and then it's clean. And then the moment I'm using, and I'm totally on your side. I'm like, I want to move into a direction where I give interpretation to what we are finding, right? But of course, I just want to make this disclaimer: you're moving into a messy territory, right? So I know I'm moving into messy territory. There's 2 things here which I find really interesting. One is a broad landscape capturing that, and that's what I showed you in this one graph, right? It's kind of you have it's almost like animal spirits, right? You have something is happening in society that is captured by the journalists because they're writing a bit more on this and a bit less on this. But there's another thing here, which is why are the conflict topics so indicative of conflict happening? Okay, and it's less trivial, right? Because it's not than it sounds, because there is no conflict yet. It's not like this period has been coded as a 0. There is no shooting, but the conflict topics are all up. And I think the reason is really, and this is why I think the LDA is doing so well, is that what the LDA is saying, these words appear with these other words together. Okay? So then, something that is not a conflict word is becoming a conflict word if it always appears in the context with conflict. So, and then this is a very, very sad thing to say, it's politically totally not correct, but a Muslim, for example, has in the English press become a conflict word, because it appears more and more with conflict words, and so when you have news stories that involve Muslims, now at a sudden a country will be classified as higher risk, right? Which is really crazy, right? It used to be in the Bosnian war times. It used to be UN missions, right? It used to be correlated with a certain risky environment, and so you have these kind of words that start to be associated, right? And they do predictive power. That's the crazy thing, right? So I could be just politically incorrect, but I'm also saying here that they actually, the model starts to learn from the unsupervised part as well. Right? It's unsupervised. I'm not giving it any information, but through the association has learned something. A bit more politically correct, perhaps. Imagine a guerrilla group is forming, right? And journalists use the word guerrilla. And maybe they even compare this situation to another situation that they know has led to conflict later on, right? So this kind of article would definitely be classified as a conflict article, and therefore the information from the expert information spills into the conflict topic and does the prediction. But all of this is pure speculation. I cannot say exactly what part of what is doing what. I can only tell you of the things we tried is that the non-conflict topics are doing more and more of the forecasting the more further you move away from the easy cases. The hard cases are getting much more information from the non-conflict part, but it tends to be still conflict predicts conflict.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.